Welcome Lethbridge College community. Today we have Major Mean with us from the 20th Independent Field Battery. Rob, tell us a little bit about yourself and what your services look like to date.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me here.
You're so welcome.
I think, talking about yourself is always uncomfortable. People are like, what am I going to say? But I'll just tell you up front, what I am, as you mentioned, is commanding officer of the 20th Independent Field Battery. So what is a commanding officer? They are basically the buck stops with them. They're the commanding officer, whoever they are in charge of everything there is to do with that particular unit. And so it's a great honor to do that. When I tell my folks about leadership, that in fact, when you are in charge of anything, the relationship dynamic is not top down, it's bottom. It looks more like this, an inverted triangle, because you now serve so many more people. So the more responsibility you're given, the more deeply humble and profoundly aware you should be of the magnitude of responsibilities you have. So that's where I'm at, which is kind of, in my mind, I think most people tell us in the military that their happiest time was when they commanded a unit, and the best times in the military. I would say, therefore I would conclude I'm at the pinnacle of my career. This is it. This is where anything after this would be considered somewhat lesser. So I am a reservist, so I have a regular job that I go to, and then, or at least I did, and then I just recently left my job. But you normally have your normal day-to-day civilian job, and then you would do military service on top of that as a part-time job. And I think that's really where, in Canada, where we need to define the difference between, some countries have a reserve, Army Reserve, and a regular Army, and the reserves train at a lower standard, and then are brought up to a standard if an emergency came up. To a degree, we do that in Canada, but we're much more in parity. We actually get the exact same training as the Reg Force in almost every respect, with only a few exceptions. And then the idea is, with extra practice, then we can then be in a position to deploy in an emergency. And of course, in domestic operations and things like that, we can deploy right away. So as a civilian, or as a citizen, I should say, in the military, I get the responsibilities of military service along with my normal responsibilities as a citizen. And that's, I think, true of all reservists across Canada.
Yeah, so the reservist piece is really interesting to me. So I work with equity, diversity and inclusion here at the college, and I'm the strategist. So we're doing a research project on what that looks like, and we're also putting into place a strategy to be the most inclusive campus we can be. So in 2018, we signed a memorandum of understanding with 12 other institutions, and it was around how can we support our reservist staff and our reservist students. So what does that support look like to you?
Well, I think the idea of, when we talk about support, is I don't think any organization is probably true, maybe more true of the military. For many military people, if you say thank you for your service, we get kind of filled on the spot.
Yeah.
Because we're comparing ourselves to what? To who? I have friends that were in Afghanistan. I never went, so I thank them for their service. I didn't go do that. And then they might look at, well, I remember that Korean War vet and the hell they went through. And then that Korean War vet might say, yeah, but I remember that World War I vet or that World War II vet and what they went through. And nobody ever feels worthy of any kind of praise like that. But what we want to be is a part of the tribe. And we want to be a part of that group. And so if you're at the college, what we want to feel like, even though maybe we're a bit different, because we're all different, we still want to feel like we're welcome.
Yeah.
And that would be the key, is to be welcomed into a group. I think people are often intimidated by the military because we have a Hollywoodized version of what the military is. And it's so completely removed from reality. But certainly there's elements of truth in all stereotypes. But the problem is they're stereotypes. They're one-dimensional pictures. They're a little quick snippet of something rather than seeing the whole movie in its fullness. And so the fullness of a person's service life, most military people are pretty much like anyone else. But they've been strongly influenced by something that's been a transformational experience. And that's actually a strength that they can bring to an organization like a college or any workplace.
Okay. So if you've got a young reservist and, I don't know, they might be 20, 21 doing a diploma, and they're also going down to the 20th Independent on a regular basis, what could a week look like for them?
Well, if they're going to school, of course, they have a heavy workload.
Yeah.
There'll be a lot of classes and then homework and things to do. The military is a part-time job, but in many ways it's a full-time commitment, because you don't we don't put away the uniform just because we're not wearing it. We're still held to a code of conduct, and we're still held to a high standard. And we're also often asking an awful lot. You know, there's not a lot of us, and there's a lot of operational requirements and or duties at the unit that have to be fulfilled. So for example, a young soldier, if she was parading with us, she would be parading on a Wednesday night, and then usually a minimum of one weekend a month, but it's usually more than that. And also there's other opportunities. So for example, maybe she's driver qualified and we've got to run people up for a weekend course in Calgary. Well, she might want to pick up the extra money to be the driver to get people up to that course. Or maybe she's on the course, and so she's going 2 or 3 weekends a month to do that course while she's also parading on a Wednesday night while she's still going to school full time. So, but of course that's up to her. She can decide whether she wants to be on a course or whether she wants to be the driver. And sometimes people have to really slow down their tempo with the Army Reserve, and other people want to max it up and be as busy as they can because they're getting paid more and getting more experiences, and maybe they just love it. So that's what they do.
So on an hourly, on an average, what would it look like for an hourly commitment per week for a reservist?
Well, per week, for the average soldier who's not in a leadership position, on an average week, well, I would say, excluding weekends, I would say it would be probably about 3 to 4 hours a week would be the commitment.
Wow,
Yeah.
I always thought it would be more, so that's really interesting.
Yeah, because Wednesday after work, about 6:30, 10 o'clock-ish, they're done. Now maybe they stay in the mess after and they have a socialization with their friends, but generally it's going to be, the work time's going to end around 9:30, 10-ish.
You brought up a really interesting word, and that was stereotypes. So full disclaimer, I'm married to a veteran. I'm the mother of a soldier and a reservist. And the stereotypes are strong for our armed forces. So how would you say that as civilians, as citizens, we can be more conscious of those stereotypes? And what would you say to maybe think about rather than just, the stereotypes that you see? What are the nuances?
Well, I would say this, that maybe this is a bit different to say, but the key is that when you look at yourself, you see a vulnerable, diverse human being who has a range of emotions and feelings, and who has a range of thoughts, and probably if you're reasonably intelligent, your views change on things over time, and you're just multi-complex.
Yeah.
That is exactly what a soldier is.
Brilliant.
The stereotype is that we're this monolith of unchanging rigidity, that we are completely incapable of feeling true depths of emotion, and that in fact we're capable of being monsters because of the portrayal of movies and these few samples that you might pick off the media of people behaving badly. But the reality is that they are vulnerable human beings, just like everybody else. And they have certain skills and certain knowledges to help them do the job they're asked to do. But the stereotype breaks down often because the media portrayal is the absolute in either weakness, cowardice, or strength and courage, right? That's the black and white story of the military. And the reality is it's not that. We're just normal human beings, and we are vulnerable, just like everyone else.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. That's a great way to put it. Just, that vulnerability that's in all of us. Yeah. So when we're thinking about folks that have served, and again, I'm just thinking back to watching my husband's settlement coming out of 25 years of service, and then immigrating here and coming into Civvy Street, as we would call it, into civilian life. What do folks like that have to bring to the table? What kind of skills and attributes and diversity do they have to bring into the workplace?
So ultimately, in much of what we do in the civilian world, the outcomes in many careers or jobs are not life and death. So let me give you an example. I worked in historic sites and museums, and I was in charge of all visitor services. Did the websites, the marketing, a lot, did the training, did guided tours on a wide range from children to seniors. If I did a really bad job, nobody died. We might get a bad review on Google. That's it.
Not the end of the world.
It's not the end of the world. Whereas a soldier often, and it could be, if you're a logistics support person and you're in charge of getting food prepped and getting out to the soldiers, if you don't do the job, soldiers go out hungry, which in a high tempo environment or really cold environment could really have really serious outcomes. If you're a combat arms soldier, you're infantry, engineers, artillery, armored, and you break one of the fundamental safety rules, people will die. And that's true of all the trades, whether working weapons or moving heavy vehicles. You know, if you're driving a vehicle recklessly and you kill all the people in the back, you know, there's serious outcomes. So we tend to look at our actions, I think, with a little more, we tend to look at the consequences as being very, very serious. So we tend to be very focused and serious. We're given a task, we tend to get really focused on it and make sure it happens. So, and we call that ownership, right? We own the task.
Yeah.
So it's not somebody else's problem. In fact, that's, if you want to know who becomes a leader in the military, the ideal is, do you own the problems? If I give somebody, here's your stove, your Coleman stove, you're in charge of making sure this works, and then they don't really care to do it, and they don't look at it as their problem to solve, that's a person who's obviously not going to be in leadership until they learn those skills.
Yeah.
Because we need someone to own the problem. It's not leaving them. They are not going to just not do it. They have to be passionate about getting the job, as mundane as it might be. We often forget that battles are often won and lost by the 19-year-old sentry who doesn't fall asleep. Yeah, and so we think, oh, we got all these great plans, we got all this great equipment, but that one human operator who is the least trained, who's really the most vulnerable in many ways, we put so much pressure on that one person. So we instill a culture of accountability. And when a person comes to a college or any learning institution, that should be one of the most defining things about them, is their ability to own their outcomes, to say, this is my responsibility.
That's an amazing way to frame it. Thank you, Rob. Yeah, so very interesting. And you bring up that word of ownership there, and that brings me on to a little bit about leadership, because I'm intrigued by the way that the military leads, and I think there's lots of things that we can all learn about for the better of other organizations and take from the military's approach at times. So ownership, I'm sure you've heard of Jocko Willink.
For sure.
What are your perceptions on the concept of extreme ownership when it comes to leadership?
Well, in Jocko's words, he regrets that title. Because he said it's not extreme. He's only trying to make out the point that it's not just I accept responsibility. No, it is your fault. Everything is, and I don't like that word fault, but it implies shame. But it is your accountability. There's nothing beyond that. So he regrets. I understand. I saw an interview where he's talking about he regretted that title, but he does like the overall idea, the sentiment of it, and I do too.
Which is, can you tell us a bit more?
Yeah, the idea is in extreme ownership is that every part of your life is your responsibility. And let me give you an example. I know a person, and she says, well, I'm this way because my dad died when I was 3. Well, she's a senior citizen now. At what point does she own that? And owning doesn't mean it's your fault. Own means I accept that I am the person I am, and I accept that I can change whatever I need to change to make my life better. And that's the thing that's liberating about ownership, as in contrast to victimhood. If you're a victim, you can't change anything in your life, or you can only recognize the problem and then feel the despair and misery of that situation. Whereas ownership is, yes, these horrible things have happened to me, but I'm responsible to make my life better. And that is the key. When you apply that principle, across your life, that would be one of the key fundamentals. And I know, this is taught in all NATO countries. We all have pretty much standardized doctrine of how we train, and we all train this idea of ownership. And if you want to see the ultimate consequence of that is the idea of, we call it maneuverist warfare, but this idea of we're overwhelmed and our potential enemies have many more people, many more resources, but by movement and by intelligent use of our forces, we'll find and exploit the enemy's weaknesses. And that's certainly Canada. Canada's a tiny army, and compared to, say, our potential enemies, they're much larger militaries than us. Well, how do we achieve flexibility and maneuverability and be able to detect? Well, one smart guy up top can be really, really smart, but he's not as smart as thousands of mediocre smart people. You don't need the smartest people everywhere. You need key people who are reasonably smart, who know and trust their subordinates to make good decisions when they see the problems that arise. And then they give the resources to those people to solve their own problems. That is a fundamental concept of maneuverist warfare. It's also the fundamental concept of how we live our lives. So we accept ownership of our problems, and then we overcome them. So it's not, when I do poorly on a test, it's not because my professor didn't give me the right materials and and it's just not a good learning environment for me, and all those perfectly legitimate reasons why we failed. They're legitimate reasons, but it doesn't change the fact that it's ownership. If your professor's not very good, well, there's YouTube. There's Khan Academy. There's reaching out to counselors. There's if you own it, that's what you do. And I like to think in the military we're attempting to transform people that they accept the ownership of everything in their lives. And that's the key part of it. That would be one of the big distinguishing things in the military, that if we've done our job right, that's what our soldiers will be.
So those that are leaving the military, those who are reservists, that's one of those traits and attributes that you see, is that ownership.
That should definitely be something that separates them.
Yeah.
That, and they should always be there 15 minutes early, because that's where we are.
Well, it's funny because I did say to our AV chap, Ryan, that I will come down and find you early because I knew you would be early today.
Right. Well, because if you're 15 minutes early, you're on time. If you're 10 minutes early, you're 5 minutes late. and there's always a reason. In fact, I was thinking about this the other day. We were on an Army exercise, and there was a mess up. And things started, everything went well on the exercise, but at the end of the vehicle started breaking down. But because we had done everything, we met all of our timings, we had all kinds of play during daylight hours to resolve these problems. And that's why we are culturally the way we are. We know that, and there's real outcomes, of course. If you're late, then, especially with artillery, they need our fires at a certain time. If we're late, we might be hitting our own troops or serving no purpose at all. So timings are really important. So in the military, we get kind of particular about that. So everyone gets that idea drilled into our heads that we're going to be there 15 minutes early.
Yeah, absolutely. And time management is another one of those skills that our reservists and our ex-military bring to the table again, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So because that's one of the things you create as a stressor in our training is timings. So if you were to join the military, the first day they're going to give you your orientation, and then after that it's going to be impossible timings. You're told, well, you've got to be 10 minutes is what you have to be fully dressed and ready to go. Well, most people are going to take a lot more than 10 minutes. And those timings are compressed to allow you to get this concept of teamwork. Yes, it's impossible for you to have all your boots done and your bed made and you showered and all that, and then the whole building clean before this time. It's impossible. You cannot do it. But your team can. And that's what we force. So time management forces team play.
Absolutely, yeah. So when you think about it, with regards to what folks have to bring to the table, reservists, those that have left the Canadian Armed Forces, what else do you see as attributes? Like, is there anything else that you think, this is something that we actually do, or this is a value that we hold that people just don't necessarily really understand or tap into on the other side in Civvy Street, so to speak?
Well, one of the things I think that we do well is that we learn to operate in a stressful environment. And we can learn we develop strategies. I'm not going to say necessarily we're good at teaching these strategies. I'm going to suggest that those that become reasonably competent in the military develop their own strategies, and that's something we can do better, is to teach these things. So we get put under tremendous stress, and you say, well, and you think, well, yeah, but are we always at war? No, that's the ultimate stress. But I will just segue a bit. I did combatives, so boxing, kickboxing. And the actual fight in the ring is stressful, but nowhere near as stressful as a training. Because you're put under pressure in training. If you're doing your training right, you put yourself under tremendous training. And it's relentless, because every day you got to show up and you got to do this training, and it builds this anxiety and stress about the pain and suffering you're going to go through to get ready for this big event. And then you actually get in the cage or the ring and you do your fight. Well, that's relatively anticlimactic. And in a way, war is similar. It's very stressful, but in a lot of ways, we've become acclimatized to the stress through our training. And so whether a soldier's a veteran who served in a combat zone or has been a reservist or a reg force soldier, and they've been through the training system, they have been used to dealing with stress.
Yeah.
And that's a very important thing. And because, as you know, in college and university, it can be very stressful. It's been reported that, and I know I still have this, I graduated years ago from university, and I will still, on occasion, wake up thinking, oh my gosh, I did not get that paper ready. I didn't get that test done,
right.
and I'm going to fail this class.
Yeah.
Or I totally forgot to even go to a class a whole semester. That's another recurring dream, the procrastination dream, and that stress that it gives, right?
Yeah.
So university students are well aware of it, and so are college. We're all aware of the stress you get about deadlines and trying to pass a test, and we really want to be successful, and our own egos are very fragile, and we don't want to be seen as weak and unable to perform. And so a soldier's been through that in spades. And when they come to an academic organization, they should be instantly familiar with, okay, I've got, I got a paper due, I've got to attend these classes, I've got to get this project done. So they should come prepared mentally for that kind of stress.
So what I'm hearing is that our reservists and our folks that have served in the CAF, basically they're coming in with that idea of extreme ownership over themselves and over their responsibilities, and then of course that time management piece, stress management, and those skills as well that often get taught, those very specific skills too. So I would love to hear from you on what you've seen with regards to changes in the military and inclusion specifically over the years, because I'm sure you've seen some changes, and
Absolutely.
I did notice that when I referred to a male soldier, you referred straight back as a female soldier. So that was really interesting just to hear that correction, and that's great. Like, we're seeing more of that.
Yeah, we are. In fact, I posted on social media a picture of an exercise that we just had, and a family member said, "Oh, boys with toys." And I said, "Actually, there's a lot of women on this exercise." In fact, our gun position officer was a female, and so our techs were females. One of our Det 2ICs, Det second commands were female. Lots of female gun members. So we are absolutely. When I started I started actually the Army Reserve in 1988 in the infantry with the Calgary Highlanders, and then I got out, and then I got back in the early 2000s. And so when the period when I first got in '88 was the first time women are being allowed into combat arms, and so there's a lot of discomfort in the organization. And if you think about it, I think for sure if we had an anthropologist who could just study this.
We've got them in the hallways.
Yeah, for sure. If you could study from it without any emotional connection, you could observe it and see that transition as some of the things that have happened would have been predictable, and are completely understandable. And if we took away any kind of judgment from it, we would say, well, we should come up with strategies to mitigate these risks and to make this a better organization. So, but it's taken time. Yeah. And absolutely, are we perfect at it? No. Just like every other organization, we're not.
No.
But I would say we're far better. So in my military experience, I've worked with lots of people of color. It's very common. And in all aspects, leadership, subordinates, my superiors, and transgendered, and females, and so we're all united in the military in one thing, and that's maybe what's different, is that we are not looking to see the divisions. We're trying to see everybody as one. Yeah. So we're all united in a purpose. So what is our purpose? Our purpose is the mission. And what is the mission? Well, the mission is to solve the problem at hand and to achieve the intent of the commander. I care about the task of the mission at hand. As individuals, I care about you, but as the task, that's the number one thing. So in the military, we say mission first, team second, self third. So we'll sacrifice everything to achieve the mission.
Yeah.
And that's good and bad. Of course, there's always a downside to everything, but that's really how we look at things, as a fundamental of how we organize ourselves. So as a group, I think what we've had to do in the military is realize, well, if that's actually true, if we are actually one, that means we have to include everyone. We can't leave people out.
No.
And we can't create a culture where people don't feel welcome and don't feel a part of it. Because the Canadian Army isn't great because we're the biggest and toughest. Because somehow we're all, our BMI is, exceptionally low, and our cardiac capacity is so high, and we're able to, think faster and better. No, we're good because we're a team.
Right.
The Roman armies didn't beat the barbarian hordes by being bigger and tougher. They weren't. They were smaller and weaker. They had an unassailable teamwork. They were completely coordinated and disciplined in a way that prevented their enemies from exploiting it. Because on one-on-one, they stood no chance. But as a team, they were unbeatable. And their empire lasted forever, and they expanded. The history of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. Well, certainly it's true of Canada, that we are a tiny little army that's never been defeated, that we've had legendary exploits, but all of it, not because of individuals, but because of the team. And when we look at the teamwork needed to go forward, we have to rid ourselves of any shame and any division that's caused by identifying people as someone not being allowed to be in our group.
Absolutely.
And so and it's a, if you look at Younger's book on tribes, it talks about the idea of, in the military, it creates this tribal culture, and it makes you feel more at home and more human than any other, and very few other organizations will ever achieve. And so we, to have that, have to have that inclusion. And I can't help but think of all the times that, you're working together as a team flawlessly and things are happening, you really don't know anything of their sexual orientation or we're all a team, and we're all deeply concerned about each other. And that's the ideal. And no, we don't always live up to that ideal. Absolutely. We're like any organization, we fall short lots. But if our direction is clear and what we want to achieve is clear, then overall we're going to keep getting better and better. And I compare it to 1988 to today. What a difference as an organization. What a difference. It's so much healthier, so much better in many, many ways.
Great. So interesting to hear just your perceptions, from 1988 to 2021 and what you've seen and seen change. But I think it comes back to that idea, like you say, of that inclusion, right? The tribal element of inclusion. So I have a question for you, and I will ask this of everybody in the Coffee With series, because I'm really interested in leadership and what leadership looks like to different people. So I know you're very reflective and you enjoy the works of Brené Brown, which just had me giggling, because again, in my head, we would never have Major Mean reading Brené Brown, that stereotype piece that I was guilty of. So I'd love to hear from your readings and your research and all the training that you've received. What's your idea of the ideal leader that you try and aspire to be?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I have leadership models, people that I've looked to and say, this person was a great leader. And historically, Churchill would be one of my tops. But also, in a military context of some of the leaders that I've worked with, and I'll bore you all with with a story from the military. But I did well on all the infantry type stuff we do in the military. But as soon as we switched to the technical part of artillery, which is math under pressure, and I'm a liberal arts major, just so you know.
Same.
I'm
not my job.
This is not my thing. And I was weak in math academically, and then of course I didn't do the artillery training until I was in my 40s. And so, I struggled in high school with math, and now years later in university I avoided anything with a number in it. And anyways, I found it to be, I didn't choose artillery. Artillery was available here in Lethbridge, so that's why I went with it. So under this tremendous stress. Often I found though that the instructors, and I won't name names, but often I would say the majority of the instructors would tell stories as if they never made a mistake. As if this perfection of standard, like they were going to set the standard for us to follow. And that's a great thing, set a standard, good. We want to see the standard. But there was a rigidity and formality to it that wasn't real. It was as if they never struggled. We never heard about their struggle. All we ever heard was, this is what's right, you did it wrong, this is the standard. I don't know why you're having such a trouble with it. I passed this, no problem, and your officers, you should be smarter than, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But we had a fellow, they just got back from Afghanistan, and often back in that time, people come back from Afghanistan, then they would go on their leave, and they'd come back, and they put them in a school, because it gives them a chance to kind of, no heavy responsibilities, maybe getting ready for another deployment or training. This is a good place to pass on their experience. And we had this warrant officer, who was a very senior non-commissioned officer, who is in the command post and doing the math and the calculations and showing us and teaching us. And he proceeded to tell us a story. And remember, he just got back from Afghanistan like a month before, and I was telling us a story. He said, yeah, I was in the box, and we had a fire mission come down, and guys were really in it. They're really getting shot up, and they're calling in artillery fire. The air observer was calling in, so a guy in a plane, he's calling in the artillery fire. But the Air Force uses degrees, and the Army uses mils. Now you think, well, why don't they all use the same? Well, there's a bunch of differences, but basically mils is almost like a metric system of measurement on the ground, and there's 17.8 mils per degree. So it's much more concise and accurate. Well, I mention all that because he's getting all the corrections of where to put the bullets in degrees. And he can't remember the math. He doesn't remember at 17.8. He could not remember. Under stress, he just totally blacked it out. And he couldn't do it.
Oh, wow.
And so somebody said, use your roamer. And he's like, what? And it's a little plastic plate. Well, it has degrees and mils on it. You can just look at it, and it almost does the conversion for you. And he said, and he was embarrassed, but he was so grateful that one of his subordinates gave him and felt comfortable enough to, give him this tip, this reminder to help him get him on track. Well, why was that a big deal to me? Well, all I'm hearing on this course is that I am not meeting the standard. I'm struggling. And here's a fellow who was struggling, and he's admitting he's struggling. He was showing, as Brene Brown talks about, vulnerability. Whereas before I was getting shamed.
Yeah.
So I'm getting shamed because, I'm not meeting the standard. You're an imposter. You're not smart enough. You're not getting it. You're, and all the internal dialogue. And on this warrant officer was saying, no, I know exactly what the situation you're in. And you know what? It's okay. You work as a team. You're not there alone. You got somebody there, and you know what? You got books, you got pubs. You can take a minute, take a breath. You don't know the answer. Admit, I don't know the answer. Let's look it up. Let's find out. But let's not send a bomb downrange until we actually know what we're doing. And that to me was like a light went off. I realized, okay, I can do this.
And you brought that in leadership.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that's a key element of it. Now, Jocko Willink will talk about when I 100% agree, and I pass this on to all my soldiers. The number one attribute of a leader is humility. And when Brene Brown talks about vulnerability, the core of vulnerability is to be humble enough to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
Because if we let our ego stand in front of us, we don't want anyone to see that we are fallible, that we can make mistakes. We want to portray ourselves as some sort of, perfection. Because that's, again, a Hollywood version of leadership. When you see the old Hollywood movies of he's going to smack you around, he's going to tell you what, and you see that. People do that in the military. They actually think this is a role that they need to do, and that's being weeded out. We don't have time for that. And I think what's great about that is that one of the great things about having soldiers who deploy overseas and go to a combat zone is they come back and they really, I think, realize the fundamentals of leadership are rooted on humility. Because you don't have time for people to pretend to know what they're doing and to fail to even admit that they don't know what they're doing. We often in the military suffer from the imposter syndrome. Because we're rushed through our training and we stand there and we think, oh, now I'm supposed to be an expert. But that's not actually true. If we actually read our training manuals, we realize that what we're achieving is competency for day one on the job. And then when you show up at your unit, they'll train you from that point on to become competent. So we assume, though, that you're somehow the standard of mastery when you finish the course. Well, how could you be? You were only there for 6 weeks or 3 months or whatever the timeline was for that course. Then you're going to show up and you're going to learn your job. Well, if we show up and we are afraid, if we show up on day one of our job and we are afraid to admit that we don't actually know everything, because we don't, then we'll never learn. And how can we lead other human beings if we're not willing to show our vulnerability? Who's going to invest in us and follow us? And so I think whatever teaching capacity we have, whatever opportunity we have to mentor, the way to connect with our subordinates is to say, yeah, I was just like you. I was struggling just like you. And this is how I overcame it. And we lead by example in that way.
That humanity.
Absolutely.
I love that. So what else would you like folks to understand or know about military personnel who may be reservists or coming out of the military, just to keep in mind when we're working in teams and so on? How do we support, how do we be inclusive?
So a lot of times our perceptions of the world affect our personalities and then how we interact with others. So there's an analogy of the sheepdog and the sheep. And I don't want any kind of negative connotation to either one of those terms. So I'm not saying sheep are in any way inferior or whatever, but they serve a totally different purpose than the sheepdog. Those who join the military will typically run to the sound of gunfire. Most people run away. So if you want to isolate whether you know you're a sheepdog or a sheep, think back to 9/11 and you hear the stories of the people on the airplane. Some people say, man, I'm so glad I wasn't on that airplane. I don't know what, I'm just so grateful. I would have been terrified. I never would be on there. People who tend to be in the military think, I wish I was in that airplane. I would have tried to do something. I think I would have been one of the people that I want to be in that moment of crisis to help solve that problem. You just feel this instinct. Yeah. Just like the sheepdog has this undeniable instinct to protect his flock. He will give his life to protect that flock. That's what separates the mindset of a soldier. So how does that affect the worldview? Well, the worldview, when you look out at all the people, you start looking at threats. Is that really a sheep or is that a wolf in sheep's clothing? And that mindset is a bit different. And it can create a cultural difference. So some people look at me and say, why do you always look at the negative in the world? I don't look at the negative. I see lots and lots of good. But I'm aware that there's a negative, and I'm aware there's a threat, and I am very much preparing for that threat at all times. And so that might seem a bit odd and off-putting, but I think in a spirit of inclusion, we can accept that both points are equally true. It is true that 99% of the time the world is, at least in Canada or Lethbridge, 99% of the time the world is very safe. You don't need to look at someone as a potential threat all the time. But it's also true that in the city of Lethbridge there are threats, there are problems, and we do need to be aware of them. So, there's a balancing act there, and I think that sometimes as a community, when we want to look at each other, pointing fingers and accusing the other of being, well, you're a soft-headed liberal, and oh, you're a hard-headed conservative, and you're a whatever, you're fear-mongering, just stop. It's just, we're on the same team,
Yeah.
and that both points are equally valid, literally equally valid, because it's not true that all things are equally true, right?
Yeah.
Or that somehow there is no strata of significance of being something being true and false, and no, everything's actually true or everything's actually false. That's not true, that's nonsense. But we do know that two perspectives can be equally true at the same time, depending on how you're looking at the problem. And I think that's where I think service people that come out of the military do tend to have a worldview that they are the protector. And that never leaves them. And so, and I think that's a good thing.
I think that's a beautiful place to finish today. I thank you for your time. I thank you for your service, as uncomfortable as that may sound. And I really appreciate you coming down to visit us today and having coffee with us. So,
well, thanks. Coffee was great, and the conversation was as well. Thank you
stay
very
in
much.
touch with us, and I look forward to seeing what we do with the 20th Independent moving forwards.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
for joining us today, and we'll see you soon for coffee with whoever our next guest is.